January 17, 1945. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence over the shattered pines. Beneath a camouflage net stretched between two frost-blackened trees, Major Ernst Richter studied his maps by the dim glow of a filtered lantern. His artillery battery had fired 3 salvos at American positions 2 kilometers west, then gone silent. Standard procedure: fire, displace, survive. They had done this for 4 years across 3 continents. The math was simple: shoot, move within 6 minutes, live another day. Oh. Richter checked his watch. 4 minutes since the last shell left the barrel. Time to relocate. Then the world came apart. American shells struck with such precision that the first salvo killed the forward observers before they could shout a warning. The second salvo walked through the battery position like a man counting steps, each explosion perfectly spaced, perfectly timed. Richter threw himself into a drainage ditch as a 155mm round obliterated the command half-track. When the barrage lifted 90 seconds later, 12 men were dead and every gun was twisted metal. Richter lay in the frozen mud, his ears ringing, his mind refusing to accept what his training told him was impossible. Counter-battery fire required triangulation, forward observers, mathematical calculation, communication, adjustment. It required time. The Americans had returned fire in less than 3 minutes with accuracy that suggested they had been watching his guns for hours. They had been, but not with eyes up. What Major Richter could not know, lying in that Belgian ditch, was that his artillery battery had been located, tracked, and targeted by a technology his army had dismissed as impractical fantasy: an MPQ-4 counter-mortar radar. A device that could detect the trajectory of an enemy shell while it was still in flight, calculate the point of origin through Doppler analysis, and transmit firing coordinates to American guns before the German shell had even landed. German artillery doctrine, built on 4 years of mechanized warfare, had suddenly become suicide. The Wehrmacht had entered the Ardennes offensive 6 weeks earlier with a confidence born of memory. They remembered France in 1940, when their artillery had moved with such speed that French counter-battery fire consistently struck empty fields. They remembered Russia in 1941, when their forward observers had called down fire with impunity because Soviet communication was chaos and Soviet mathematics was slow. They had spent 4 years believing that artillery was a game of movement and discipline, that the side which fired and relocated faster would always survive. They believed this because it had always been true. American industry had made it obsolete. The NMPQ-4 radar units had arrived in Europe in the autumn of 1944, strange constellations of wire and metal that looked to German observers like radio equipment. Intelligence reports mentioned them briefly. Electronic range finding, possibly. Nothing that would alter the fundamental arithmetic of artillery warfare, but by January 1945, every American field artillery battalion had access to radar-directed counter-battery fire. German gun crews that had survived Stalingrad and Normandy began dying in their firing positions, killed by shells that arrived before they could displace. The old rules no longer apply. Fire, discipline, camouflage, rapid movement, none of it mattered when the enemy could see your shells in flight and calculate your position before your gun had finished recoiling. German after-action reports from the Ardennes campaign carry a tone of bewildered frustration. Batteries reported taking accurate counterfire within minutes of their first salvo, sometimes from American guns that should not have had line of sight to German positions. Forward observers reported that American artillery seemed to fire without forward observation at all, that shells arrived with precision against targets that should have been invisible. One artillery commander wrote that American counter-battery fire had become uncannily accurate, as if directed by clairvoyance. The word radar appears rarely in these reports. Most German officers did not understand what was killing them. They simply understood that the Americans had changed the rules of a game Germany had been winning for 4 years. The psychological impact was immediate and cumulative. German artillery crews, among the most veteran and disciplined formations in the Wehrmacht, began to hesitate. Guns that should have fired 20 rounds per hour fired 5, then fell silent. Batteries that should have displaced after 3 salvos displaced after 1. In some sectors, German artillery simply stopped firing altogether, the crews unwilling to broadcast their positions to an enemy that could see through smoke and forest and darkness. The Americans did not need to destroy every German gun. They simply needed to make German gunners afraid to fire. Radar accomplished this with brutal efficiency. Major Richter survived the Ardennes. He surrendered to American forces in April 1945 near the Ruhr Pocket, his surviving men exhausted and his battery long since destroyed. Years later, in interviews conducted for German military histories, he spoke about the moment his war ended in practical terms. Not the final surrender, but that January afternoon in Belgium when American shells had found him with impossible speed. "We understood then," he said, "that we were fighting a kind of war we had not prepared for, a war where technology had made our training worthless." He paused in the interview, searching for words. They could see things we could not see. They could calculate things we could not calculate. How do you fight an enemy who has made you obsolete? The MPQ-4 radar was not a decisive weapon. It did not win battles by itself. But it represented something that German doctrine had failed to account for. American industrial capacity married to scientific innovation, deployed with speed and scale that made traditional military wisdom irrelevant. The radar units were crude by later standards, prone to mechanical failure and limited in range, but they worked well enough to kill German gunners who had survived years of war. That was sufficient. In the frozen forests of Belgium, beneath the smoke of a dying offensive, radar pulses swept through the darkness, invisible and patient. Each transmission was a question sent into the winter sky. Each return signal was an answer that meant death. The Germans had brought their discipline and their experience and their pride. The Americans had brought mathematics made visible. In the silence between salvos beneath the falling snow, the future was being written in electronic echoes that no amount of courage could evade.